So think about it. You only got so much energy in life. You only got so much energy. Forget time management. I'm talking about energy management. And yet so much of our energy, if we're honest, oftentimes goes to very temporary stuff and things. And it seems like Jesus is suggesting just that. So the story goes, Jesus is speaking, or maybe there's a lull, and some guy goes, "Hey, Jesus, hey, teacher," right? "Settle something for me. Tell my brother to give me half of my inheritance." In other words, what's right? So this is how the whole journey begins. And Jesus says, you got to beware of greed. He says, first of all, that's not my matter. I didn't come here to make sure everybody got, their retirement. That's not my matter. He says, but I would like to say this to the whole crowd. You need to be real careful about greed. He's like, in fact, let me tell you a story. There's a man, a very successful farmer, and his crops yield a plentiful crop, so much so he realizes he's got so many crops, he doesn't have a barn big enough to store them. So he thinks to himself, what am I going to do? Well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to build a bigger barn. This guy's American, I'm going to he lives in Texas. I'm going to build a bigger barn. And he takes his leftover crops, he builds a bigger barn, he stores it up. And when his savings account is full and his retirement is ready to roll, and he's got the great car, he's got the big house and the white picket fence and the American dream, he tells himself, I'm good. I did it. I'm great. And Jesus says, and God says, that night his soul was required of him and he died. Now who gets your stuff? He says, so is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. First of all, a couple observations we'll make tonight. Jesus seems to be alluding to the fact as he moves into a whole diatribe on anxiety that oftentimes our anxiety is connected to temporal stuff. Temporal stuff. Now this is a very interesting passage because it speaks volumes, particularly if I could be very direct, it speaks volumes to many of us living in the Western world. We are the home of stuff. We're the home of stuff. And by the way, Jesus never says the stuff is wrong. It's how you relate to the stuff that can be healthy or not healthy. So he tells this dramatic story. Life is like a day. Life is like one day. And you spend all day working hard to save up your money and you die that night. It makes you start to think like, how would I treat stuff if I only had one day to live? You know what I mean? Would I care about the rims? Would I care about the paint with the mirror? Would I care about the white paint on the walls and the handprints if I had one day? It's an old cliche, I understand, but it is worthwhile to consider and think about how would I live? Jesus is saying life is short. Life is short. You storing up stuff. You're giving yourself, your priority is savings accounts and checkings account and retirement and things and possessions, none of which Jesus has said is bad. It's just not nearly as important as what is eternal. Jesus says now to his 12 disciples, the crowd dissipates. We don't know how the scene changes, but he turns now to the 12 and it's just 13 of them. And he says, I therefore, based on what you've just heard, I want to continue the discussion. This is all connected. He says, don't be anxious about your life. Don't be anxious about your life. Watch what he does. What you will eat, nor about your body or what you will put on. So he says, hey, let's talk about the necessities. I don't want you to be worried about food. I don't want you to be worried about clothes. Now, we gotta stop for a moment and ask ourselves an important question. Is Jesus saying you should never be concerned with the basics? No, I want to say this first and foremost. It is only natural for you to go, man, I want to make sure my babies have clothes. I want to make sure that I got some food. I want to make sure my fellow man has food and clothes. Yes, this speaks to some of the basics. But if you look at the context, remember it was greed, it was covetousness. And he connects that to anxiety. So this is not so much a teaching on you shouldn't be worried about clothing your body. You should just be naked with no food. No, that's not, no, he's a good father. What he is saying, what he's uncovering for us is maybe a very significant source of our worry, our fear, and our anxiety, and that is we don't like the food and clothes we have, we want more. Success is defined by climbing the proverbial ladder. It's like, what's next for me? How can I gain more influence, more prominence? That is always the goal. Jesus suggests that that might not actually be healthy in regards to your emotions and your feelings. I want more. Be leery of that desire. Why do you want more? Jesus says, he goes on, he says, now I want you to consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds, Jesus gives us two actual, literal, practical exercises we can do when we are battling fear, worry, and crippling anxiety. And the first is go for a nature walk, and I'm not even joking. He says, consider the ravens. Consider the ravens. And then you go down, it says, and consider the lilies. And here's a practical, we're talking, putting things in proportion, putting things in their place. Literally, and I grew up in a church movement that oftentimes we kind of, not devalued nature, but almost ignored nature. But nature is there to tell you the story of the glory of God. It's also to tell you the story of how powerful and wonderful and caring and the ecosystem itself declares the care and the provision that God gives to us. And guess who the centerpiece of creation is? It is you. You are the primary source of his love. He died for you. He didn't die for the birds, didn't die for the whales, didn't die for the oceans, didn't die for the mountains, didn't die for the trees. He died for you. Now all that will be restored, but you were the focus of his attention, and you were the focus of his forgiveness, and you were the focus of his love. So when you go for a walk, pause, put your phone down, and just think about it. Just think about it. Watch the waves come in. Watch the ecosystem work. Listen to the birds chirp. Feel the sand under your feet. Watch how these trees, Jesus says, watch the bird. They neither sow nor reap. They don't have big old savings account and checkings account. He says, but I take care of them. How much more valuable are you? How much more valuable are you? Man, we get so myopic, don't we? We get tunnel vision. All we can see is, I don't have this, they have this, she has that, he has that, I need this. Sometimes we need to put it all down and literally just digest, ingest, take in all of what God has put into motion. He says, I want you to look at the flowers. God says, look how much glory, look how much coloration, look how much distinction I put into flowers. And then he calls lilies grass, which is to say, flowers is like grass to me. It's nothing compared to you. Listen to the words of Jesus. He can't exaggerate. He says, Solomon, the richest man who has ever lived and will ever live, never had clothes like the flowers. Never had clothes like the flowers. How much more valuable are you? Another observation, look at verse 26. He says, if then you're not able, watch this logical deduction. If you're not able to add a single hour to the span of your life, why are you anxious about the rest? In other words, Jesus asks a very important question. Can anxiety do even a little good for you? Has worry ever produced an extra hour? Verse 29, it says, so don't seek what you're to eat and what you're to drink, nor be worried. That's an interesting verse. Now, the word seek there in that verse literally means to set your heart upon. Ain't nothing wrong with good food and nice clothes. But something very detrimental starts to unfold in your soul and your brain and your body when you set your heart upon things like clothing, food, status, symbol, social media. Wait, I'm sorry, the CD skipped there. Social media. When you set your heart on these things like public perception, position, renown, and when you set your heart upon it, by the way, one of the indicators you've set your heart upon it is it becomes your identity. It becomes your identity. It becomes what you are rather than just something you're wearing or something you're eating or a job you temporarily hold. It becomes your entire identity. Jesus says when we set our heart upon these things, many anxieties come. Many anxieties come. Have I become a product of all this stuff that I'm collecting? Who am I collecting this stuff for? Remember the story. He's like, you work your whole life to get all these toys, and then you die. And what then? Remember what Jesus said? He said, so is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. Jesus is not mad at your toys. He's just saying if your toys distract you from growing rich in your relationship with God, let go of some of the toys. Right? Okay, so you stop the sermon there and it's like, hey, stop setting your heart upon these things. And that's a very negative approach to life, and I don't recommend it. Right? You wake up tomorrow morning like, I gotta stop getting my emotions worked up with my Instagram, right? Okay? Instead, seek his kingdom, and all this stuff will just be included. Wait a minute. And by the way, this isn't the only place Jesus says that. He says, set your heart on his kingdom. Set your heart on his kingdom, and these things will be added. Well, Romans chapter 14, verse 17 says the kingdom of God is not eating or drinking. It is righteousness, peace, and joy by the help of the Spirit of Jesus. Jesus says, I want you to think about righteousness, 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 and that will produce in you a peace and a joy. What is this righteousness that defines the kingdom? It is gifted righteousness. It is imputed righteousness. What does that mean? It means you cannot earn it. You cannot deserve it. You cannot know enough to warrant it. It simply is given to you by what Jesus did on the cross 2,000 years ago. Jesus' words still ring true today. He said, it is finished. What is finished? The great divide between sinful man and a holy God was finally bridged by the finished work of Jesus on the cross. He who knew no sin became sin so that we become the righteousness of God in Christ Jesus. All the wrong we did has been covered with the finished work of Jesus. And by simply accepting and receiving, not earning or deserving, we literally categorically become righteous with our Creator. He says that is what defines my kingdom. Think about righteousness. Think about the gift of Jesus. Think about what he did on the cross. Remember what he said. Remember who he is. Remember his ways. And talk about Jesus, and you will have transcendent peace of joy, not circumstantial emotions. This peace and joy is not connected to your job, to your clothes, to your food, or to your social media. This peace and joy is connected to one thing, that you were made righteous with your Creator by Jesus. And that ensures you are forgiven forever. Past, present, future sin, you are forgiven forever. The message is clear. This is the receiving of the grace of God and the finished work of Jesus. And it goes on and he says, fear not, little flock. Fear not, little flock. For it's your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Forgiveness isn't hard to find. God's love isn't hard to find. He's present. He's amongst us. He loves us.